If you look at the Detroit-Windsor corridor from above, the contrast is striking. The aging Ambassador Bridge, congested, creaking under decades of traffic, privately owned and bursting at the seams, sits on one side, and just a few kilometers downriver, the Gordie Howe International Bridge gleams in the sunlight. 8 lanes of reinforced concrete and steel, built to streamline trade, to connect two nations, and to serve as a symbol of economic cooperation for decades to come. Its opening, planned for next month, was supposed to be a simple, historic moment, a handshake between Canada and the United States, a promise that commerce and industry would flow without disruption. But 59 hours ago, that narrative changed dramatically. Donald Trump stepped in with a threat that has rattled Washington, Ottawa, and the trading floors of North America. In the early hours, Trump posted on social media before most people were awake, signaling that the United States would refuse to staff the American Customs Plaza unless Canada acquiesced to a series of aggressive, near-impossible demands. Suddenly, the bridge that was meant to be a symbol of cooperation became a potential flashpoint. Trump believed he had leverage. He thought the mere threat of a blocked bridge would bend Canada to his will, forcing Prime Minister Mark Carney to rush to Florida, offer concessions, and validate Trump's position as the negotiator in charge. But Carney did not blink. He did not fly south. He did not issue dramatic statements filled with anger or outrage. Instead, he went into a press briefing in Ottawa and quietly, methodically, activated a strategy that few in Washington anticipated. To understand the significance of this moment, you need to grasp why the bridge matters. The Gordie Howe Bridge is not just concrete and steel. It represents the flow of tens of billions in trade every year. Daily, products, parts, and energy move across the Detroit-Windsor corridor. A disruption here doesn't just slow trucks. It halts assembly lines, creates shortages in factories, and reverberates through grocery stores and gas stations across the Midwest. Every hour that border agents fail to staff the bridge, the ripple effects grow. Trump's plan was classic in its intent: create a crisis, tighten the screws, and then offer the solution only if Canada surrendered to his conditions. The demands included changes to dairy policies, restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles, and fees for trucks, essentially a trade shakedown disguised as border security. American media immediately reported headlines designed to amplify fear. Trump blocks Canadian bridge, trade crisis looming. But Carney responded in a way that was almost invisible to casual observers. A terse, carefully worded statement mentioned reviewing operational energy infrastructure corridors in the Great Lakes region. On the surface, this sounds like bureaucratic filler. Yet the market understood immediately. Unlike Trump, Carney was speaking in leverage. He wasn't threatening words. He was threatening systemic impact, the energy supply that keeps the Midwest running. Consider what's at stake. Pipelines delivering crude oil, natural gas, and propane feed refineries in Michigan and Ohio, power factories, fuel airports, and maintain heating for millions. A subtle restriction in energy flows could cause gasoline and heating prices to spike, industrial production to slow, and Wall Street to recalibrate risk assessments in real time. And Carney knows this. He is no drama politician. He is a strategist who thinks in risk, leverage, and systemic consequences. The contrast is clear. Trump is using a physical symbol, a bridge, to exert pressure. Carney is using a networked system, energy, supply chains, currency, and finance, to counteract it. And in this moment, the world is watching. The Gordie Howe Bridge may be steel and concrete, but what surrounds it is a chessboard, where economic and political power is being measured move by move. In this first part of our series, it's essential to understand the stakes. A century-old myth of a frictionless U.S. Canada border is being challenged. Trump believes he has a simple lever. Carney is showing how interconnected systems can nullify that lever. And for the millions of people whose livelihoods depend on cross-border trade, this isn't theory, it's reality. To truly grasp why the Gordie Howe International Bridge matters so profoundly, you need to look at the numbers and the flow of goods across the Detroit-Windsor corridor. This route is not just any border crossing. It handles roughly 28% of all trade between the United States and Canada, amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars in goods moving every day. Automotive parts, raw materials, agricultural products, and industrial supplies cross this border multiple times before reaching their final destinations. For example, An individual car might see its parts cross the border 6 or 7 times. A transmission in Canada, seats in Michigan, electronics in Ohio. Any slowdown at the border does more than delay delivery. It can halt entire assembly lines. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, and neighboring states rely on these shipments to keep production flowing. A delay of even a few hours can ripple through logistics, forcing manufacturers to pause production and potentially lose millions in output. That is why Donald Trump's threat to withhold staffing at the American Customs Plaza immediately grabbed attention. Without customs officers, trucks cannot legally cross, and the bridge cannot operate. At first glance, this looks like leverage, a pressure point where the U.S. could force Canada to meet demands. But the reality is far more complex. Canada, for its part, is not unprepared. Under the leadership of Mark Carney, Canadian authorities are considering multiple ways to respond without escalating the situation unnecessarily. The strategy isn't about confrontation for confrontation's sake. It's about ensuring trade flows, protecting citizens, and maintaining leverage over vital infrastructure. The Canadian government's announcements about reviewing energy infrastructure corridors are subtle, but they carry weight. These pipelines supply significant portions of propane, natural gas, and crude oil to U.S. refineries and households, particularly in Michigan and Ohio. Any disruption could have serious consequences for energy supply, but Carney's goal is not to shut anything down arbitrarily. It is to signal that Canada holds critical resources that Washington depends on. The market's response to these developments has been telling. When news broke that Canada was assessing its operational energy networks, traders reacted immediately. Futures for heating oil and propane in the Midwest spiked, while the Canadian dollar ticked upward. This reaction shows that the financial world recognizes the power embedded in Canada's control of energy resources. It also underscores a key point. Trade and energy infrastructure are deeply intertwined, and miscalculations can have cascading economic effects. Meanwhile, automakers and supply chains are closely monitoring the situation. The old Ambassador Bridge is already operating at capacity, which is why the Gordie Howe Bridge is so crucial. If the new bridge's opening is delayed, the older crossing becomes a bottleneck, slowing deliveries and increasing costs for companies that depend on just-in-time logistics. Union leaders, auto manufacturers, and logistics firms are quietly assessing the impact, knowing that their operations could be affected within days if tensions escalate. At its core, this is more than a border dispute. It's a case study in asymmetric leverage. Trump is attempting to apply pressure using a physical asset, the bridge, as a tool. Carney, on the other hand, is leveraging systems, energy supply, trade logistics, and market perception. It's a reminder that in modern geopolitics, the most effective leverage often comes not from the loudest threats, but from understanding the networks that underpin economies. For everyday people, the stakes are tangible. Delays at the border can impact car prices, fuel availability, grocery costs, and manufacturing jobs. The outcome of this standoff is not just a political story. It directly affects the pocketbooks and livelihoods of millions on both sides of the border. In Part 3, we will break down exactly how the energy infrastructure plays into Canada's leverage, why certain pipelines and power lines matter, and how the markets are reading Carney's moves, all while Trump's administration recalibrates its strategy. Understanding this next layer is key to seeing why the Gordie Howe Bridge is not just a bridge. It's a focal point of economic and strategic power in North America. While the Gordie Howe Bridge grabs the headlines, the real leverage in this standoff may not be the steel and concrete of the bridge itself. It's energy. Canada controls critical energy infrastructure that supplies millions of Americans, particularly in the Midwest. One example is Line 5, a major pipeline running from Western Canada through Michigan to Ohio and into Ontario. It carries crude oil, natural gas liquids, and propane essential for refineries, airports, and heating systems. To put this in perspective, Line 5 supplies roughly 58% of Michigan's propane needs, fuels refineries in Toledo that produce gasoline and diesel for the Midwest, and supports jet fuel for Detroit Metro Airport. Any disruption in this pipeline could ripple through energy markets, leading to shortages, price spikes, and logistical challenges across multiple states. This is where Canada's approach under Mark Carney becomes strategic. Rather than responding with dramatic statements, Canada is signaling, in bureaucratic language, that it holds assets vital to U.S. infrastructure. This is subtle but powerful. By reviewing operational energy corridors, Canadian authorities communicate that they have the ability to influence the flow of energy without actually doing so, a controlled threat that recalibrates leverage in negotiations. Meanwhile, markets are already reacting. When news of Canada's assessment hit financial outlets, Midwest heating oil futures rose, and energy traders immediately priced in the potential risk. At the same time, the Canadian dollar strengthened slightly, reflecting confidence in Canada's position. These market movements indicate that investors recognize that Canada has control over critical supply chains and that the U.S. cannot unilaterally dictate terms without consequences. But the impact extends beyond energy prices. Automakers, manufacturers, and logistics companies are highly dependent on both smooth border crossings and energy supplies. Factories operate on just-in-time production schedules. A delay of hours or days can halt assembly lines, leading to lost production, increased costs, and cascading effects through supply chains. In other words, while the bridge is the symbolic battleground, energy infrastructure is the tactical advantage. Carney's approach also reflects a broader strategy known in economics and geopolitics as asymmetric leverage. Trump attempts to apply pressure with visible, immediate tools, threats to block the bridge or impose tariffs. Carney, however, leverages systemic elements, energy, logistics, and market perception. The result is a quiet but highly effective counterbalance. Instead of escalating confrontation, Canada is signaling capability and control, letting the consequences speak for themselves. It's also worth noting the political implications. U.S. policymakers must now consider not only trade optics, but practical consequences. Any move that disrupts energy flows or supply chains would have immediate effects on voters, especially in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. These are states where industrial production, energy access, and fuel costs are directly tied to Canada's energy exports. By maintaining a calm and controlled posture, Canada maximizes leverage while minimizing the risk of actual disruption. For everyday people, the stakes remain clear. Delays at the bridge or interruptions in energy flows can impact car prices, heating costs, fuel availability, and grocery prices. For businesses, a slowdown in supply chains can halt production, delay shipments, and affect revenues. What's happening is a real-world lesson in how interdependent modern economies have become, and how power can shift without overt aggression, simply through strategic control of resources and systems. In Part 4, we'll explore what this means for the future of U.S.-Canada relations, trade policy, and economic strategy, including potential scenarios, what could trigger escalation, and how Canada's approach might reshape negotiations for decades. With the Gordie Howe Bridge ready to open and Canada quietly signaling its leverage through energy and trade systems, the question becomes, what happens next? The next few weeks could define not only the bridge's operational future, but the broader dynamics of U.S.-Canada relations. Scenario 1. Diplomatic resolution. The first and most likely path is a negotiated quiet resolution. In this scenario, Trump's administration recognizes that delaying the bridge has real economic consequences for U.S. states. Automakers, manufacturers, and energy companies would raise alarms, emphasizing potential job losses, supply chain disruptions, and rising costs for voters. Canada, meanwhile, maintains a calm, measured approach, signaling readiness to cooperate but without conceding to politically motivated demands. Through diplomatic channels and backroom negotiations, a mutually acceptable staffing and operational plan for the bridge could emerge. The bridge opens, trade flows normally, and both sides claim minor victories. This outcome preserves economic stability while reinforcing Canada's position as a capable, sovereign partner. It's a classic demonstration of strategic leverage without escalation, using existing infrastructure, energy resources, and supply chain control to ensure outcomes favorable to Canada. Scenario 2. Escalation. If the standoff continues, the situation could escalate. An executive order, additional tariffs, or administrative delays could heighten tension. Energy corridors and pipeline supply could become a more visible factor as Canadian authorities carefully monitor the impact on cross-border trade and domestic markets. Even minor disruptions can ripple through industries. Midwest heating oil, gasoline, and propane markets could experience short-term spikes, affecting both households and businesses. Factories relying on just-in-time delivery may face temporary slowdowns. In such a scenario, both countries could experience short-term economic strain, but Canada's measured approach limits the potential for catastrophic disruption. This scenario highlights how interconnected supply chains have reshaped the traditional tools of negotiation. What once might have been a simple border threat now intersects with energy, finance, and industrial systems, demonstrating the complexity of modern trade and diplomacy. Scenario 3: Strategic Pivot. The final scenario involves Canada using the situation to diversify trade and reduce reliance on the U.S. In recent years, Canada has invested in alternative trade corridors, including ports on the Atlantic, partnerships with the European Union, and growing ties in Asia. If the bridge standoff persists or threatens long-term disruption, Canada could accelerate these initiatives, signaling to the world that it can maintain economic sovereignty without being dependent on a single neighbor. The bridge remains operational, but Canada increasingly demonstrates that it can balance trade relationships, leverage critical infrastructure, and negotiate from a position of strength. This scenario has long-term implications: a more independent Canadian trade policy, stronger energy leverage, and a recalibration of U.S. Canada economic interdependence. For American policymakers, it underscores that traditional pressure tactics may no longer be effective against a country with integrated infrastructure and global trade options. Key takeaways: the Gordie Howe Bridge is more than infrastructure. It represents trade, logistics, and economic integration. Energy corridors, pipelines, and supply chains give Canada subtle but effective leverage in negotiations. Market reactions, from fuel futures to currency adjustments, show the tangible power of these systems. Trump's approach, relying on immediate, visible threats, contrasts with Canada's methodical, systemic strategy. The outcome will affect not just trade and energy, but long-term geopolitical trust, economic stability, and cross-border cooperation. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Modern trade disputes are rarely about a single object or location. They are about interconnected systems, leverage, and strategic thinking. Canada's approach demonstrates how thoughtful, calculated moves can protect national interests while avoiding unnecessary escalation. As the Gordie Howe Bridge opens and the standoff evolves, the world will be watching. The bridge may be concrete and steel, but what surrounds it, the flow of trade, energy, and strategic leverage, tells the real story of economic power in North America.